Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this POPVOX Foundation and Bipartisan Policy Center Casework Navigator program on Introduction to Appropriations for Caseworkers. This is our second event in the Casework Navigator series, so thank you all so much for taking the time to join us to talk about a topic that's a little bit removed from ordinary casework responsibilities, but as we will try to make sure that you come away with today, we think it's very important for caseworkers to know about and caseworkers to kind of have some basic fluency in. There's a lot that it can do for stakeholder relationships, for developing relationships within your office. So we are so excited to have a casework focused deep dive into appropriations today. I'm Meeker. I'm the Deputy Director for the POPVOX Foundation. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we will jump right into today's program. Okay, so like we said, we are covering appropriations for caseworkers today. If you've been to one of our events in the past, you've had to sit through me talking a little bit about my background, but I'm a former caseworker. I'm a former director of constituent services. And I will share that every spring when our DC staff sat us all down and said, it's appropriations season, it's time for us to start thinking about appropriations requests, I tuned out. I opened up my email in another tab. I found excuses to leave the room because I just didn't think this was relevant to me at all. I had no interest. This sounded complicated. This sounded scary. So don't be like me. And today we're going to try to make it easy for you to figure out how appropriations fit into your work. 5 quick reasons why this is helpful. I'm going to kind of go through these to give us some framing, and then I'm going to introduce our speaker today, and we're going to jump into our Approps deep dive. But as caseworkers, you undoubtedly work with a wonderful network of local stakeholders, folks that refer casework inquiries to you, folks that you reach out to lean on for their expertise and their connections in your state or district. Appropriations give you an opportunity to try to give back to those folks, to say, hey, you've been so helpful to our constituents. Here's an opportunity you may not have been aware of for federal funding that may be helpful to you. Gives you a chance to strengthen those community resources. If there's a gap in services available to your constituents, working through an appropriations request or a community project funding, congressionally directed spending request may be a good opportunity to help strengthen some of those gaps. And then just thinking for the role that caseworkers play in your office, you have incredible local expertise on what's available in your district and what your constituents need. Getting involved in the appropriations process is a great chance to actually use that expertise and make that expertise available to the rest of your team. Fourth, when you were talking to agencies about why they are falling down on the job to serve your constituents, you're probably going to hear something about how, well, we're underfunded and we're behind schedule in this thing that we need funding for. So having a better understanding about how agency funding works is going to really help you come into those conversations better informed. And then last but not least, as we've started this Casework Navigator program, one of the things that we keep hearing from offices is, hey, how do I build a better relationship with my DC counterparts? How do I build a better relationship with my legislative team so that, when we have a casework problem, they take it seriously. They're ready to listen to me. And this is a great opportunity to kind of start to build that relationship, to establish yourself as a working partner for some of their work, in addition to just bringing casework problems to your district team. So that's the framing for why we're doing this topic today, even though we know it's a little bit out of the box for ordinary casework. So hopefully that's going to be helpful. At this point, let me introduce our speaker today, who is one of the experts on appropriations and earmarks. I am so pleased to introduce Franz Wuerfmannsdobler from the Bipartisan Policy Center. Franz and I have been working together for the last few years on some of our joint materials to help support offices through the recently reinstated earmarks process. Franz has a deep background in handling this on the Hill, with more than 2 decades of experience serving in Congress for multiple senators, many of whom were appropriators, and additionally his work on the Senate Appropriations Committee. We are so pleased to have Franz join us today, and Franz is going to dive into the basics for the appropriations process. So Franz, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks a lot, Ann, and we definitely have enjoyed working with POPVOX and especially with Ann on a variety of topics. There's sort of excellent resources. We're both in the same space to help Congress and Capitol Hill staff have better tools and better understanding to do their work, and did work in 3 congressional offices, and also very much appreciate the type of work that you all are doing. Just to kick it off very briefly, you will hear some different terms just want to explain those a little bit so you have a better understanding that there's a lot of connection between them and among them. Earmarks were the historic term. It's the type of terminology that had been used in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, sort of describe member-directed spending. The House term, which has been used for in the last Congress, the 117th, is called community project funding. The Senate term is called congressionally directed spending. These are the two same terms that are sort of the post earmark ban, and sort of with reforms and greater accountability and transparency. And then a good catch-all phrase for you all just to be aware of is oftentimes we'll call it member-directed spending, but overall community project funding, congressionally directed spending, member-directed spending are all basically the same idea. I like to start off with this little cartoon of sorts, which gives a bigger picture view of some of the challenges of governing and governance and the challenges of legislating. You see that the top left corner is kind of like, say, a bill as introduced, and it's not quite right, but it's the general idea and the process it often goes through when it goes before any type of legislative body. The bottom right corner is essentially what was needed to tire swing. The fun challenge is essentially, if you think about that very middle one, which is how policy ideas, programs are funded by Congress. So in this case, it didn't get funded, but what we want to talk about in this case is appropriations, which is synonymous in the same thing as what is called discretionary spending, the amount of funding that has to pass Congress essentially every year, in lieu of the mandatory spending, which is like Social Security, Medicare, et cetera, which is sort of on autopilot. So we're not going to talk about that side of it. These are some key entities to be very aware of within the process of the appropriations process or the budget process overall. So first of all, of course, is the White House. This is the president and all of the agencies who propose the funding and then sort of are charged with carrying it out. The key entity within the executive branch and the White House is the Office of Management and Budget. And then its counterpart in Congress is the Congressional Budget Office. Congressional Budget Office was established in 1974. The entire sort of budget framing process that Congress used was established in 1974. That's the Budget Control and Impoundment Act. And that sort of essentially is the process by which Congress has followed for this almost 50-year process. The authorizing agencies, authorizing committees of both the House and the Senate also do have a role to play. They are able to provide oversight when the president's budget comes before Congress, and that will now be happening on March 9th. He will be submitting that request. And then at the same time, the budget committees are supposed to look at what are called the budget resolution. We won't go into that in this case. We're going to focus a little bit more on the House and Senate appropriations committees. One of the key things to know about that is that the authorizing committees jurisdictions don't always fully align. So for example, there's the House Science Committee, which on the Senate side is the Commerce and Science Committees. There's the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, which on the House side is split up a little bit. But in the appropriations world, there has to be parallelism on the House and Senate side. So essentially there's a full committee and there are 12 subcommittees, and those 12 subcommittees align in the same way on both sides in a bicameral way. And this is an ideal world to walk through in terms of the annual calendar for the budget and appropriation cycle. And we're going to go through this in a lot of detail, but one of the things to just kind of point out is that there is this is the 118th Congress, and the process has started to begin going through for the FY24 appropriation cycle and the overall budget requests. The president gave the State of the Union in January, and now the president will be submitting a budget. So we're a little bit sort of kind of like delayed from that standpoint, but in the ideal world, the president would give the State of the Union and then submit his request to Congress. That then sort of flips the switch for the budget committees to start their process. The appropriations and authorizing committees do the same thing and begin oversight. Members have requests that they can begin submitting to the Appropriations Committee for things that are priorities within their office. And that's where it sort of begins to touch on the type of work that you all may be involved in. One of the things that's highlighted here is to also point out that in Congress, usually deals with one budget cycle at a time. But it's important to note that on the federal agency side, they're often dealing with multiple budgets. So they have already had the fiscal year 22 budget, which they're fully implementing, the fiscal year 23 budget, which was completed in December. They're definitely moving along in terms of implementation on. And then the FY24 is going to be submitted to Congress. And maybe go to the next slide. You can see that these are some other sort of milestones that are kind of keys to understand about what happens with this budget and appropriations process, that Congress is supposed to get a budget resolution. In lieu of that, what often is required for the Appropriations Committee to begin its work are essentially what are called the 302A and 302B allocations. In a very basic way, the 302A allocation is just the top line number that is provided to the Appropriations Committee for it to begin its work. And the 302B allocation is the individual amount that each of the 12 subcommittees has for all of the agencies within that jurisdiction. So a key part of appropriations is what is the overall number, and then how much does each subcommittee get? And these subcommittees are kind of interesting and unique. We'll kind of get to that. But, again, let's go back to the calendar here. You can see that in May and June and July, they start to hold hearings and markups in the committees and the floor. Next slide. And then in an ideal world, those bills would be passed out of the House side and the Senate side and begin to be negotiated and finalized. As we all know, it is very rare, and it has not happened, that appropriations have been negotiated and finalized by the beginning of the new fiscal year, which is October 1st. And so that often requires continuing resolutions, which then, as like in this last cycle, continued into late December. But to kind of go back to the one other point I was making is that the presidents, the cabinet agencies, and all of the agencies that you might be working with are already thinking about fiscal year 25 by the time the late fall, the August, September is coming around. And they're beginning to lock down the next fiscal year's budget in terms of the request in like the November, December timeframe for the president to make that request in January. So there's a lot happening in Congress, but also be very aware there's a lot happening by the federal agencies. And this is a great way to explain, just to give a brief introduction to both the breakdown of the appropriations process, but also to begin to start digging into the member-directed spending types of requests. These are the 12 appropriation subcommittees. They get varying amounts of money. So, for example, the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee and the Military Construction Veterans Affairs Subcommittees, in a way, they kind of make up about half of spending. This is the defense side spending. And then if you were to take those other 10 together combined, they also would make up the other half of spending. That's the non-defense or the domestic discretionary spending. Some of them also make sense in this way. It's kind of simple to understand. When Homeland Security, that's the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, that is basically that one agency. But a lot of these subcommittees include multiple agencies. One of the most complex one is financial services and general government. I kind of think of them as siblings, varying sizes, different personalities, etc. In terms of earmarks or member-directed spending. We've highlighted that there are, on the Senate side, there are 9 of them which have individual requests that are allowed members to make requests. The House allows the defense subcommittee to have member requests. So within each subcommittee, there are certain identified accounts that are allowed for a member to make requests against. And we are beginning to just learn what the accounts are available for fiscal year 24. We have done some work to look at the last 2 years, and we're kind of waiting to see what the House does on this front with the member guidance and the deadlines and the accounts that are available. But the overall thing is to understand that there are these 12 subcommittees, 9 or 10 of them are available for members to make individual requests to, and know that there are important deadlines to meet in the next couple of months. And this is to touch on a key thing that, so in 117th Congress, individual member requests were allowed again. But prior to that, for a 10-year period, there were kind of 2 ways for a member to make a request. These were called programmatic requests, where they could ask for a certain amount of money for a certain agency, or they could seek bill or report language, which could be included in the House side or the Senate side process. Now this member-directed spending request is a little bit different in terms that it requests a certain amount of money for a certain place by a certain member. So the member's much more tied to that specific request. There have been additional accountability and transparency requirements. For example, for-profit entities are banned. Members have to submit letters that they don't have members and their immediate families don't have financial interest in the project. Those things have to be posted online on your office's websites, as well as on the committee websites, et cetera. So they're also short-term in duration, so they may be only for 1 year, so versus a longer-term period, as with some of the programmatic requests. But this will give you an idea. There's essentially a member can choose a funding request, bill or report language, or participate in this additional request, which you would need to understand the key accounts that are available for that from the previous slide. And there's a lot of talk about, so how much money is spent on these types of requests? Well, to sort of dial out to the bigger picture, this is a pie chart showing sort of all federal spending, and that, as you can see, the largest share of that is the mandatory spending, as well as a portion of that is the net interest on debt. Within that sort of 1/3 of the pie, which is discretionary spending or the appropriations process, there is also a new requirement beginning with this last Congress saying that no more than 1% of that can be used for this sort of earmarking process. So of all the members, so 535, actually with the territories, sort of 541 different members have the ability to make requests for this 1%. And last, in fiscal year 23, that ended up being a total amount of about $16 billion. Not all members chose to participate.
All right, in the meantime, maybe let's jump forward while we're working on getting Franz's audio back. And I can jump into a little bit of the recent history, and then we'll try to bring Franz back in for the wrap up on the timeline. So sorry, folks. We'll try to get this working in the background here. But in the meantime, so as Franz was talking about, so that is so earmarks are overall a very small amount of federal spending. And as we've also talked about just very briefly, the ability to bring back earmarks has only been here for the last few years in the 117th Congress. So we had a first reform period when earmarks were offered 2007 to 2010 with some additional transparency and disclosure requirements. And then there was that 10-year moratorium. And that moratorium is important because we all know the rate of turnover for House and Senate staff. And so we really lost a lot of institutional knowledge for how to do earmarks in the meantime. And so that's important just because for a lot of offices, this is a brand new process. Even if your member has been here for a long time, there's still a chance that your appropriations team is still kind of getting their feet under them for what is this process and how are they going to engage with it, which means it's a great chance for caseworkers to kind of take this moment to jump in. And I do just want to flag, we've mentioned this in a few of our events in the past, but the return of earmarks was in part because of the titanic efforts of the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. This was the Bipartisan Select Committee on the House side that made recommendations for Congress's continuing improvement in function and operations and all that good stuff. So one of their recommendations was actually to bring back member-directed spending and bring back earmarks. And there are a few reasons for that. First of all, they wanted to frame it as Congress reclaiming Congress's Article 1 responsibilities, but also just giving individual members kind of more leeway to engage in this process. So kind of have members have a little bit more stake in these giant annual budget negotiations, in addition to using their on-the-ground expertise to support their constituents and districts and states. So that leads us to today and where we are in the upcoming FY24 process. There are a lot of question marks for us. So we've said this is members participating in member-directed spending is new. And this will be the first time that we will be seeing this under divided government. And the House has advertised that they are planning to make some changes to the earmarks process. So we have two new coroners for the appropriations. The coroners are the chair and the ranker in both chambers. And just a flag that all four of them are women for the first time in history, which is a pretty cool thing. The parties have traditionally been a little bit divided on whether these are a good thing or how much should they be subject to increased transparency requirements. So with the GOP in control on the House appropriations side, we are expecting to see some changes beyond the fact that the House GOP has promised that we will be debating the annual appropriations bills in an open amendment process on the floor, which will open up to a lot more difficulties. The last thing to say is if the appropriations process gets stalled with that open amendment process on the floor, we could end up back in continuing resolution territory. Oh, Franz, are you back? All right, can you say something to make sure I can hear you?
Hello, I can hear you.
There we go. Let me go ahead and let you take over for this last bit. And we have the real expert. Go.
Oh, I think this covers it. Let's see. One of the key things, you may have mentioned this, one of the key things that we are waiting on still is what the guidance will be from the new House majority, what type of requirements they will be placing. And the Senate released its guidance on Friday, and we're still waiting on the House guidance. And there may be some additional requirements that they'll put in place when there would be debates on the floor, including what we don't fully know for sure, but that's the open amendment process. So.
All right, Franz, thank you so much. Thanks for your patience with us handling the AV issues here. Classic, we've all been on Zoom for 3 going on 4 years now, and there's still always bumps and hiccups. But all right, so at this point, I will take over and let's talk a little bit in a little bit more detail about what does the whole process of appropriations look like in your office? And then as a caseworker, where and how can you start thinking about how to engage? So for most offices, and I will flag that this kind of breakdown is from the BPC and the POPVOX Foundation's resources for congressional staff on best practices for setting up a member-directed spending process. But for most offices, there's going to be 6 big steps for how do you start taking in requests from your constituents, do your vetting, and get those back out to the committee. So step 1 is understanding the rules. As Franz said, these have changed every year for the last 3 years that these have been allowed. So there's always some new information, and especially for new offices, getting up to speed on appropriations and how to run an appropriations process is no small task. This stuff is complicated, and it's really important to get it right. Number 2 is education and outreach. So as Franz said, for member-directed spending requests, come from constituents. So they come from constituents, they're for specific places, they're for specific programs, specific nonprofits, government issues. Excuse me. And then they have to come into the office for that vetting. But the important thing there is to make sure that your constituents and eligible requesters in your district are aware that this is possible and that they know how to engage with your office and the timelines, deadlines, and rules for doing that. So the education and outreach is a big task as well. Then you have your standard intake process. This is where there's a lot of overlap between your earmarks, your member-directed spending process, and some of the other processes that as caseworkers, you are really good at. So your intake for casework, your intake for your service academy nominations. If you have a really well built out grants program, this is where things are going to start to feel familiar and where some of your processes are kind of scale here. And then your vetting and decision process. Is everyone who's applied to you eligible? What are your members' priorities for actually how to decide among your multiple competing applicants which ones to send off to the committee? I don't think we've mentioned, but this is really important on the House side. For the last 2 years, the House has been limited in the number of requests individual members can submit. The Senate has not been. So it's a little bit more of an important process of vetting and decision making on the House side, just because they are limited. And then 5 will really be on your team's appropriations person, but this is sending requests to the committee. And there is a process to go through, as Franz said. Members have to make disclosures about whether they have any financial stake in the people that they're sending on for these requests. And then last but not least, we all know this is important from casework, is closing that loop with your applicants to say, yes, your request was submitted to the committee, your request didn't make it this year. Here's what else you can think about doing. So for caseworkers, the 2 boxes here, steps 2 and 4 that we have in turquoise or teal, I guess, are really the places where caseworkers can shine. This is where your expertise, where your relationships, where your interest in this process can make a difference and really kind of help complement and supplement the work of your legislative team. So, and just for an example, I always think it's really helpful to kind of bring it back to concrete examples. So this is one that came up in the last year. This was Representative Krishnamurti from Illinois. So again, we've talked about just how to read some of these requests. So this is from the Health and Human Services. So this is the specific eligible account that was open for Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, health surveillance, and program support. So if you went to the committee's website to look at this eligible account, you'd see specific guidelines for what types of projects are eligible here. And so this is one that Rep. Krishnamurti submitted for a local nonprofit that was providing behavioral health and supportive services. So each office for each project has to submit a description, a little bit of information about what that project would do. So you can read a little bit about that project here. So you can see there's a really strong casework connection. I'm sure many of the caseworkers on this call, if not all of you, have had some calls about substance abuse and had some calls about local options for treatment. So definitely a lot of these accounts have really strong linkages to the kinds of projects that you're seeing in your community. The other thing to flag that's also helpful is that, as we said, members submit their request to the committee and they request a specific amount. There is technically no limit on the amount that members request for projects. That does not in any way guarantee that the committee will fund it at the level the member requested. So for this one, this team requested $335,000 and they got $140,000 enacted in the bill. So it's as you're starting to have these conversations with your constituents about what this process looks like, it's important to note there's a lot of uncertainty on a lot of different levels. There's uncertainty in the budget process and the budget and appropriations process as a whole, like we said, maybe veering off into continuing resolutions. And then there's also uncertainty in whether their project will be chosen. And then there's uncertainty if their project is chosen, if it will be funded at the level requested. So good to just kind of have all this information in your head as you're starting to think about how does it fit into your workflow. So like we said, with those 2 steps where caseworkers can really fit in, first big one is outreach and education. So if you, like we said up top, if you have local stakeholders where you're like, yes, they have been talking to me about a project that sounds like it might be a really good fit for an appropriations request, for a member-directed spending request, that's awesome. You really want to be careful to talk with your team, talk with your outreach team, your communications team, and especially the person on your legislative team who is running your appropriations process about what their plan is before you start talking to folks in your community. So check with your team, check on the wider plans for outreach. And if you're interested in doing the outreach and education, how can you be helpful? Are there materials ready to go that your team has already developed that you can send out to your stakeholders? Can you be helpful in trying to corral people into a webinar that your team is hosting on your process? Just what are the plans, and then how can you fit into them? Like we said, if you are helping with the outreach and education part, be really clear on the uncertainty of earmark requests. Especially for a lot of small nonprofits, for small governments, even though earmark requests can be a little bit less taxing and less time consuming than some other federal grants, there's still a major investment in time and energy that not every office, not every entity will think is a worthwhile trade-off for the amount of uncertainty involved. So just be really clear and upfront. For a lot of earmarks, this is like a nice to have project. It's probably not a good idea to kind of base your financial strategic planning on getting an earmark through the appropriations process. The last thing is to prepare your potential applicants for success. So in the last funding process, as part of the earmark process, GAO audits a selection of requests, and they found that for some of them, funding was delayed to these entities because the entity wasn't ready to accept it. So for example, for a nonprofit, they didn't have their 501c3 status documented and ready to go with the IRS. And so they weren't technically eligible to receive the funding, even though they'd been accepted, been approved, it had gone through the appropriations process, the omnibus passed, awesome. So just be ready to tell your applicants, hey, there's going to be some extra work on the back end that you're going to need to be ready for if and when you get this money. And then last but not least, you all know how to do this. This is the really delicate balancing part of being a congressional staffer, that you need to preserve your relationships here. Don't go making promises that you can't live up to, and make sure that if you're doing the education and outreach, you may want to be clear with folks, hey, I am not going to be involved in this selection process. That's a decision that's entirely made by my member, by our legislative team, by our community advisory board, whatever you end up doing. But just to be clear, if you put your neck out there and say, hey, local community organization, please apply for this earmark, and then they don't get it, make sure that you're ready to kind of repair that relationship in any way that's responsible. Then, like we said, the other option for caseworkers to kind of be involved in this process might be using your local expertise to help vet the decision. Again, this is going to be especially on the House side, but there are also some great opportunities to be involved in the Senate. So we have an 8-part, and I'll link to this later, but we have an 8-part guide to how to vet applicants that your office may not be familiar with, but we break it down into, there are the rules, then there are the ethics, and then there are the politics. And it's good to kind of be aware of all three. So the rules are just, is this person, entity, government eligible for this earmark? Again, these are only open to nonprofits. These are only open to government entities. No for-profits can apply for earmarks. So that's just vetting to make sure that they meet the rules. Then there's the ethics. This is where some of your on-the-ground knowledge might come into play. Members have to declare that they don't have a financial entanglement with the folks that they submit to the committee. But are there any other reasons that your team might not want to consider something for an earmark? Is it going to look, just think about how it would look on the front page of your local paper. If there's any way that it could be interpreted as, well, this member was really close with this organization, and so they, prioritize them over someone else who is more worthy. Your antennae and your ability to understand what's going on the ground is really helpful information that your team might benefit from. And the same thing goes with the politics. Like we said, you have those relationships, you have those local stakeholder contacts, you know the gossip, you know who's up and who's down and what those relationships are. And that's all information that can be really, really helpful to your team if there's a way for you to kind of bring that into your process. So again, that comes down to your team's process. So before you're thinking about getting involved, check with your team. If you want to be involved in vetting requests, figure out what their process is. Are they sending things out to community advisory board? Are they opening up for constituent comment? Just what is your team's process for vetting requests and making that decision, and how can your expertise fit in? And then, like we said, again, just the long-term priority has to be maintaining those relationships that you have. So if your team is vetting requests and it's clear that you are on the kind of group of staffers who's vetting those requests before they go to the member for the decision, make sure that your stakeholders don't think that you are choosing kind of who's up and who's down. It's just be really, really careful to avoid a real or a perceived conflict of interest based on your work. And another great thing is to, again, use those casework skills and just say, hey, if you're not selected for an earmark request, what else can I offer you? In that letter that says, dear so-and-so, we're so sorry, it was a really competitive field. We couldn't submit your request to the committee. Think about what else you can offer. Are there other grants? Does your office have a grants page? Do you have a grants newsletter? Are there any other things that you can flag that might help kind of ease that rejection a little bit? The other thing to think about is that for a lot of local nonprofits and local governments, this is also a long-term game. Some of them might not be ready to submit a request this year. Again, it's kind of tricky to figure out where something so uncertain might fit into your funding. You can think about this as a long-term relationship. If you're not ready to submit this year, okay, we can tell you about it this year. You can watch how it goes this year, and then maybe next year you'll be ready. And then last but not least, like we said up top, this is such a good opportunity to think about how can you develop that two-way relationship with your legislative team. I think it's really easy sometimes as a caseworker to come in guns blazing to your legislative team and say, oh, I'm hair on fire, I've got this problem. What are you guys going to do to fix it right away? And this is kind of one of those few opportunities where you can kind of give back a little bit. Say, hey, thank you so much for the oversight letter that you did for Social Security on administrative law judge delays. Can we be helpful in the appropriations process this year? Is there anything that we can do to use our local expertise, use those local stakeholder relationships to, again, do that, help with that education and outreach to help as your team is starting to vet requests coming in? And just really think about it as it's not just your stakeholder relationships. Your stakeholders also include your legislative team and the rest of your team, your office team. That's your comms team, that's your leg team. So think about this as kind of a little bit strategic. Just how can you approach this process to really build those relationships? And let me just flag quickly before we open up to questions. As we said, we do have resources available. We are releasing this year's version of kind of the pre-detail guidance on Friday. So check back to our team. It's popvox.org/earmarks, and we will have updated versions of these guides available on Friday. So this is a guide for member offices. Again, if you're new or looking to kind of streamline your process from the last year, a guide to setting up an interactive, transparent, accountable process to make the requests available to your constituents. We also have a guide for constituents. So we talked about that education and outreach. I'm not certain on the Senate side, but on the House side, CHA has clarified that you can send nonpartisan factual information from an outside resource to your constituents if you do it in a hyperlink. We all love really fun, specific congressional rules. But you can also send that to constituents if that's helpful too. Last but not least, we have a quick guide for journalists on how to interact and how to understand the earmarks process. So if your comms team is starting to think about working with your local media, we have a quick myth-busting, fact-finding resource for journalists on covering this as well. So at this point, we are so excited to take some questions and talk with you all about how does this fit into your team's workload? What are your questions on approaching this process? How can we be helpful? So please go ahead and drop those into the Q&A function. But Franz, maybe I can kick us off here. Can you share any examples from the last few years of teams where you've really seen just do a wonderful job on their outreach, or where they've really been able to involve their district staff?
Well, I would say that maybe answer. There's a number of offices done great jobs with the sort of outreach overall, and it really does have to be on a strong PC and district basis. So for example, the Senate has announced that what its guidelines and deadlines are, and we're still waiting on the House side. But some offices are brand new, but just one of the key things is to begin to be prepared as early as possible. So it's not too early to get moving and to start thinking about what that is. A lot of key member requests definitely bubble up from the state. the staff in DC don't always know about them, and it is definitely not a requirement to retain a lobbyist to be able to get that. So, a good working relationship with the person who has that point of contact in the office, the appropriations person or the budget person, along with the legislative director, are pretty important to do that. And then thirdly, and as you mentioned briefly, the role of the communications person to be able to describe this overall process and the opportunities that are available are key, both on the front end and the back end once they've been enacted.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And Franz, we just got an audience question that I'd love to get your thoughts on. Catherine asks, do applicants need to have unique entity identifying numbers, what used to be SAMs, in order to access the funding? This is definitely something caseworkers are going to hear from groups on.
To be honest, I don't know, not familiar with UEIs. So.
Yeah, fair enough. I think in a general sense, it's good to know that for each agency, so again, we've talked about, we have the subcommittees, then we have the eligible accounts that fit under specific agencies. We talked through the HHS SAMHSA example. So recipients need to meet those agencies' requirements to get their funding. So if that agency offers other grants, sometimes you can look through what the requirements are for those grants on grants.gov. Definitely flag for your constituents that it may be an option, but it's going to depend on the agency and going to depend on that agency's requirements. Great question.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Folks, good questions. And please do keep them coming in. We have a couple more minutes for questions. We're happy to handle anything that's on your mind. And Franz, let me maybe ask a broader question. So we've covered the basics here. We've kind of gone through the appropriations process and then focused in on those earmarks and member-directed spending. There is so much to learn on appropriations. It is so complex and so detailed. It can be really intimidating, but there are really good resources out there. If we have caseworkers who are interested in learning more, where would you point them?
Sure. Well, I would say that both of our websites have some good basic information. I've not looked, say, in the last week or so, but honestly, the Congressional Research Service has done some good reports about this type of information in the sort of the bigger picture. They did have an FAQ about sort of member-directed spending and earmarks. They have done some reviews on that. So, I would say definitely the CRS can be a good place to get some of the background information. And then we will be, both of our organizations will be updating our websites in the next week or so, but definitely putting in a plug for the specific information that POPVOX is going to be releasing on Friday.
Definitely. And the other thing to flag is the GAO Funds Tracker. If you want to look a little bit in more detail at some of those specific requests that got funded, and again, we'll link to it, but GAO's website on tracking the funds is also a really interesting primer.
I see we have a couple of questions coming in here.
This is such a good question, and I'm really excited to hear your thoughts. So someone asks, I work for a member who doesn't support earmarks. However, a different member in our delegation did, but they are no longer in office. We are now fielding many questions about how applicants access those dollars, and we are at a loss for how to answer. We've reached out to our agencies, but they couldn't answer either. Any guidance for what happens when an earmark is authorized? What happens then? Franz, where would you start to help out this person?
Maybe a lot of guessing as to what that might be, but it would be important to be in touch with, say, the Congressional Affairs Office of the agency to ask them. This is maybe a member who either lost or retired last Congress or stepped down in some way. I would start with the Congressional Affairs Office and ask them about the status of that. If it was, say, a fiscal year 23 request, it may still be in the pipeline because that's something that was just funded in December. If it's about fiscal year 22, then the funds have been out there have been enacted for just under 11 months. So the agency congressional affairs folks should be able to help with the various status of the request if it has already been enacted. I'm assuming that that's what they're trying to work through.
Definitely. And the last thing to flag there too, and Franz, I know you worked for the committee, maybe you can speak to this a little bit, is so in the last few cycles, the committee staff for House and Senate appropriations have really been a phenomenal resource to individual offices on answering those nitty-gritty questions, including what happens after things get enacted. So if you haven't already been in touch with the relevant committee for your chamber, definitely worth reaching out to them, and they might have some more insight there too. Franz, do you have anything else on committee?
No, I think the agency is the first port of call, but I'll actually I definitely also be aware and let the committee staff know about that, because they can be helpful too as an ally. And definitely happy to jump in on this next question too about seniority. As Ann has mentioned, and is the case with the 117th Congress, the House put in place a requirement that there had to be a cap on the number of member requests. So for first year it was 10, and then the second year it was 15. And based upon some work that's been done and just general evidence among members, is that this really has begun to democratize the process among House members who do decide to make requests. So every member has a cap, and it doesn't always mean that that member is going to get all 10 or all 15 of them, but really does provide a fighting chance for members who don't have as much seniority and can work with that. What it has meant, I'll just say within the 10, that whatever the House cap is, you really have to think through the types of requests you want to put forward, because I'm sure you're going to get far more than the 15. You kind of think about what the strategy is with, if it's the committees the member sits on. Other members have sort of distributed it among various counties that they represent, or they have certain sort of policy priorities. So you got to think through that side of it. And I don't know if there are staff who are on that might be from the Senate side, but the Senate does not have a cap, and it has been the case that the vast majority of the senators who have made requests, they do get their requests, but the senators have made many, many more. And so it is kind of a different dynamic, because many senators are putting forward hundreds and hundreds of requests and not getting all of them. So that is a different dynamic. But, you know, very much I would say from the House side, because there is this sort of cap on individual member requests, that really has begun to democratize the process.
That's such a good point. Yeah, and really good question. The thing I'll add there too is, again, as a caseworker where your boss is not on relevant committees, it can sometimes feel kind of frustrating that, you know, the things that you're hearing from constituents just aren't showing up in what your ledge team is doing. So let me flag that appropriations requests can be a way that members kind of show that they are still accountable on issues that aren't in their main portfolio. So sometimes it's a really good way to actually make some headway on your issues that you see as a caseworker. So for example, if we had a member on space science and tech, and then on budget, you know, we're not seeing legislation come up on Veterans Affairs, but being able to show that that member secured an earmark for a local veterans charity is something that some members might think is a really strategic decision. So definitely it's a good thing to talk through with your ledge team. Just what are the priorities? What is your member interested in funding? And then again, how do you plug into the process from there? And Franz, actually, maybe that leads us to another question that I wanted to ask you. So we've really focused on earmarks in this session, just because it's kind of the most casework adjacent side of the appropriations process, and kind of some of the most complicated work around appropriations that will happen right now. But thinking to our audience member whose member doesn't support earmarks, can the programmatic and the bill language requests kind of also be used to move forward casework issues?
Absolutely. I can kind of maybe give you a couple of different examples that of a couple of programs that are out there to indicate support for. These are sort of long-standing types of support. Many of you may know sort of like challenges that certain communities might have, say, in paying their energy bills or things like that. This one is called the Weatherization Assistance Program, and another is called the Low Income Home Heating Assistance Program. The first is out of the Department of Energy. The second is out of the HHS. And these help people who don't have as much money or sort of meet in certain income requirements to help pay their energy bills, or sort of energy, or help their home become more energy efficient. So this is a way that if you are hearing back from those folks, and maybe the member doesn't support sort of a member directed request, they could express support for these types of programs in the request to the subcommittee. So one would be Labor HHS subcommittee, and the other would be the Energy and Water subcommittee. So those are just two of many, many different programs out there and accounts out there in which they can do that they don't have to make an individual request. And again, the individual requests are limited in a couple of different ways. But yeah, for many, many years, the programmatic requests by funding level or bill or report language have been the ways to identify what some of the members' priorities are.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And then maybe wrap up, unless, again, we still have a few minutes for questions. So please drop your questions in the Q&A box. And let me also just flag before we move on to our last question here. Franz and I are both very accessible and happy to talk to folks about this process. If you have any other questions that you'd like to follow up with us on after today's webinar, we will be delighted to talk further with you. But Franz, let me maybe ask you to talk a little bit about BPC's work here. So I know that you guys have been doing some wonderful research and work on this process since long before the Select Committee's recommendation to bring this back. And I think you have a report coming out soon. Can you just flag some of the things that you're watching that are kind of interest and on your radar in this year's process?
Thanks for that. Yeah, as I mentioned, POPVOX and BPC are releasing the constituent guidance and the office guidance on Friday. Early next week, we have done some research and looked across the entire 117th Congress on all of the member requests from the Senate, the House, and both parties. And so we'll be releasing that. We'll also include among those things 5 different recommendations for ways to improve and enhance the processes that are already in place by the Senate and the House. So that will be on our website. And then as we're looking into the future, we have believed that this is an important part of the Article 1 responsibilities of members of Congress, the power of the purse. And this is one way for a member to play a role as a legislator and advocate for their community. So going back into the 116th Congress, we made a series of recommendations to Congress through a couple of different avenues that were in part the framework by which this new system was set up, including calling for prohibition on for-profit entities and a cap on member requests, et cetera. So very happy sort of like to work with Congress and find ways to set up the process. And we have a few recommendations coming out in the next week. Let's just say that it's more the fine tuning of the process that's already in place.
Franz, that's wonderful. And I, for one, am very excited to see the report when it comes out next week, along with all of the wonderful data and the research that your team has done. Wonderful. Franz, thank you, as always, so much for joining us to share from your experience in all of appropriations world, and especially for earmarks. For me, at least, it's really exciting to kind of hear about some of these more in-depth, weedsy legislative topics, but in kind of the realm of casework. So thank you so much for being willing to join us and take us through them. Before I wrap, go for it. Yeah.
Thanks for having me on. And casework played an incredibly important role in offices, and I definitely as an advocate and supporter, and believe that my colleagues who are doing that type of work played an important role in the various offices I was in too.
Wonderful. We really appreciate that. It's always lovely to hear that from a former legislative staffer. Wonderful. And then the last but not least, let me just flag again. So as we said up top, so this event is part of our Casework Navigator program that you should have received an email from me on earlier this week, last week. So just wanted to flag again that all of our resources are available at popvox.org/casework. This one we did make available to everybody because the appropriations season is coming up fast. And again, there are so many good ways for caseworkers to get involved. I just wanted to flag for folks. So this is the kind of topic that we're really looking forward to covering in our professional development series over the next year. This professional development series is a subscription-based program from the POPVOX Foundation for offices that kind of dives into the, I don't even want to say casework like 201 or casework 301 stuff, but kind of the casework adjacent stuff. The how can you take your casework to the next level? What are the things that aren't the block and tackle of just in and out doing constituent services that are nonetheless going to make your casework team stronger, more integrated into the work of your office, and more exciting to do. So stay tuned for more information on that. We will be opening our subscriptions to the professional development program later this month. But in the meantime, all of our resources on our kind of casework basics manual, including how to work with agencies, how to close cases, how to keep constituent information safe, are all available at popvox.org/casework. So thank you all again so much for joining us. Again, please send us any questions, comments, suggestions, and we will look forward to seeing you at events soon. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.